Thank you, Steve. In the meantime, I'd just like to remind everybody that if anybody is dying for a coffee, it's out there. Self-service. We've been talking a lot about data and understanding how procurement might perform and how we scrap the bottom of the barrel to understand the things that we did understand for this report. But there's much more work that could be done and much more progress that could be achievable. To be very brutal, compared to where we are now to where we could be, is we're in the Stone Age of procurement. So let me present a little bit first a lead-in, and then Adrian is going to showcase us a Starship Enterprise.
We're not getting red cards.
Okay, so procurement is currently challenged by two things. First, we have limited data on procurement performance. How do we connect the contract, its type, design, and how does that affect the outcomes? Second, our challenge is the evidence-based approach. Who has an evidence-based structured decision support tool today to make a decision how a particular project should be procured? And this is a rhetorical question because the answer is no one. And we'll talk about that later. So as Aris was mentioning before, we have a large spectrum of different contract types. And we have ideas how these contract types might perform, but we have very little evidence how they actually do. And this is a major inhibition in advancing our understanding of procurement and optimizing it. And it's important to understand that billions of different currencies are at stake here. So the most evidence we have with regard to contract performance is about on-time, on-budget delivery. And this is an example of most of the studies, but not all of them, that dealt with on-budget delivery for road contracts at different stages of the project gestation. So you can see a clear pattern where earlier in the project life, ex-post cost of run is larger, and as you get closer to the contract value and you actually sign a contract, the design gets more detailed, the cost variability gets lower and lower. But this is pretty much almost all we know. There are a few other examples, a few other studies. And we have ideas how these contract types work. For example, if we bundle design and build, we might reduce some problems. And there's some evidence that design and build is better in terms of on time and on budget compared to design bid build. But there is no comparison in terms of end cost. It might be that design and build is actually more costly than design bid build. But we have insufficient data to make that determination. Then there are questions about enforcement packages, life cycle cost optimization, and so forth. A bigger issue beyond all this is going beyond construction. How do the questions how we organize a contract and engage with the private sector affect the in-house transaction costs, something we have been talking today. And the second question is, how does it ultimately affect service levels? So if we really want to advance our understanding of procurement, we need to have a link between procurement design, impact on construction, impact on operations and maintenance, and ultimately service levels to build something called an iron triangle in terms of data. And in the report, you will find an example of one such initiative where we proposed how this could be done. It can be done, but the countries are not very eager to share this data for reasons that nobody likes to be exposed to any kind of accountability. And even if you offer anonymization, we're still facing defensive behavior. So one of the objectives of this report is to raise awareness that not having this information and not having this understanding how to optimize procurement further is costing us a lot of money. So when we were doing our working group, and working on our project, one of the findings was that from our part, if we want to optimize an incentive structure for a particular contract, we should not think about the contract as given, or a project scope as given. So often when politicians give an order, they want to have a particular thing built or an asset. Procurement authorities tend to think about the scope as a predetermined fact. But in every project, there will be a series of activities, and all those activities will be different in terms of uncertainty, in terms of how much information is available, and applying a single contractual incentive scheme or a single risk allocation principle to those activities will probably be suboptimal. So one of the things that came out of our research is that it's probably sensible to start thinking of projects as bundles of activities. So we got to there, and then we met Adrian, who started 15 years ago, thinking about these things already, but not from a risk pricing optimization perspective, but from perspective how developing different bundles of activities impacts competition and how it might affect life cycle costs and so forth. The questions behind how you form your bundles has actually to do with what should you make or buy, what will be the impact of life cycle cost, and which bundles should be based more on competition, which means hard-on friction between bidders, and what types of activities should be subject more to a collaborative approach. Now, I won't go through this, but let me tell you that there's a lot of theory that one can build on to make those determinations. And that theory is incomplete. And Adrian has been working on completing that theory and has a model that will need to evolve, but I think it's almost there. So, Adrian, please, take over.
Well, you're doing very well. Thank you for a low attrition rate at this stage. Better than my students, because by Friday afternoon it's just me and the student who's in the wrong class. So thank you very much, Dejan, for that. This is just to remind ourselves as to what might currently happen in practice. This is a series of steps here from an approach to procurement in Australia, which I understand is similar to the UK, and typically used around the state government departments around Australia. And just if you're really interested and can't sleep one night, this is an example, a recent example. This is going to be, if it's built, Melbourne's, Victoria's biggest road project, and there's a link there. It's the North East Link. And this is a very good example. If you look at the business cases, it's a very good example of these steps that I'm just referring to here. So I just wanted to mention probably just two of these steps, just to give you a sense of the disproportion to which Dejan was alluding well, actually didn't allude pretty much. He said it clear out that we're in the Stone Age. So with the first step, there's a lot of data gathering that goes on amongst the agencies in Australia, and that gets right down to a lot of nitty-gritty in terms of the information that we have in the business case, right down to construction risks. Now, mindful that in a business case we may only have a line between two centres as being essentially what the road where the road's going, and a lot of information gap clearly because it's at a very early stage of development. And yet, it's not unusual for governments to pay lots of money for consultant engineers to sit down and spend 3 days to try and second-guess construction risk amongst in the project. And for example, in this business case that we've got here, there's a lot of work here on TBM, on the boring machine and the risks associated with that, despite all the information gap that we're facing. And then, if you look across steps 2 to 5, for another reason, we then tend to veer to the other end of the extreme. So having sort of veered towards a lot of detail, and as I said, it's largely inappropriate given the information gap. We then veer to the other extreme, and you'll see in that example that I've got there, it's a good example, this one, of how at this other extreme we attempt to create some criteria, a matrix criteria across the top, which are largely sort of skewed towards what the client wants to see, the agency wants to see at the end of construction, as opposed to what they think they want to see in operations. And then down the columns or the rows, you've got the various stereotypical procurement approaches, PPP, different types of PPP, D&C, and so on, all the sort of models that we've been talking about today. But they're very stereotypical, not necessarily very innovative. So at that point, what we're seeing is that we haven't got a tool, and this is the key departure that we're making. We haven't got a tool to guide ourselves in terms of to measuring risk in a project. So Klaus mentioned it this morning, and I think what he said I thought was really good, and he said that we need to understand our projects better. So there was an attempt to understand our project right in that step one, but it's inappropriate because it's at a level that isn't appropriate to information gap. And then there's the other extreme which we go to when we roll up all the risks, and then we try and match the stereotypical procurement approaches to those risks at the entire project level, and tick off and score those stereotypical project risks relative to the client's requirements. So we haven't got anything. We need something in the middle. And this current practice of veering from one side and then to the other in terms of procurement decision making leads to a number of suboptimal outcomes. And it's not unusual, as Tom Jones would say, for us to see that we've got a situation where agencies are dishing up huge projects, a multitude of activities that really don't necessarily go well together. There are no necessarily any synergies across those. And of course then we have a situation where only the big clientele, if you like, or diners are able to consume that plate. In other words, the tier one contractors and other consortia of that nature. And so what I'd like to do is just to illustrate that problem with regard to one case that we looked at, which is a big road in Australia. And this was a $500 million road, and it's got a number of interesting components to it. It's got some tunnel work, some driven tunnel work, some cut and covered tunnels. Also, it's got some rail alignment in the middle there, and it's also, but the rest of it is regular, simple for engineers, simple on-grade elevated structures. That's it, probably about 50% of it. So, but it's actually procured using a big alliance. And that alliance yielded, or that procurement approach yielded 2 expressions of interest. So the starting point in terms of bidding is 2 firms. Now that was actually one of 8 roads that we looked at, which had only 2 expressions of interest. So this was a study we did, Australian federal grant we finished in 2013, and we had $32 billion worth of infrastructure projects across roads and health projects. And you can see that it's got a skewed histogram here, and it's interesting because we can begin to see immediately that there may be bad things that come out of this sort of profile of expressions of interest, and certainly lack of competition, given that we've got that at an extreme there, with only 2 expressions of interest, and there's a reasonable evidence to indicate, as we know, that we need at least a few, probably more, 4 or 5, probably 5 minimum, to begin to get some serious downward pressure on prices. And at the other extreme, we can actually have too many firms bidding or expressing interest to bid. And one of the reasons we might see firms falling over backwards in order to bid for projects could be that they see variation flows in projects, super projects, super profits rather. It may be that government perhaps are too soft in terms of what they're transferring. Maybe the private sector are demonstrating through their interest that there's a really good deal in it for them. So somewhere between, say, 5, there's more hard evidence for 5, and somewhere between 15, but perhaps closer to 8, there's some evidence to indicate that after 8, you see flat line in terms of pricing relative to the number of expressions of interest. So somewhere between 5 and 8 might indicate optimality in terms of managing to avoid market failure, thin markets, lack of competition, and also market failure post-contract, which might be arising from very costly variations. So from there, we began to look to see how we can actually move forward and address that weakness that I started with in that first step, that we haven't really got a structured tool to break a project down along the lines that Klaus was mentioning this morning. The first thing we did is we looked at some economic theory, and one of the theories we looked at helped us greatly in terms of identifying transaction costs across technological boundaries. So what we do is we take a piece of infrastructure, that example I gave you before, and we break it down into its technological components. So where you have an activity that involves a different knowledge and skill set, different engineer perhaps in terms of design, then you have a boundary, a technological boundary. And we also cut off at non-trivial activities. So in other words, they've got to be significant in terms of their cost relative to the overall size of the project. That road I showed you generated around 130 activities. So the important point here is that relative to that veering that I described at the beginning, we have now a bundle of risks in each of these 130 activities that, whilst we don't know whether any of those risks are actually going to happen because of the information gap we face in business case, what we do know now is we've got a mechanism, or we've got a level of analysis by which we can more robustly measure whether government or the market is better placed to deliver those any risks that might unfold out of that bundle or that activity bundle. So that's the key departure. Then Dejan mentioned that we go on to look at a make or buy decision. Now this is not as tricky as it looks. Actually, it's a lot trickier. But just to attempt this without getting a red card, just to attempt this, what this depicts is that at two ends of the spectrum, government can do things that market can't. So at level 1 there, or pattern 1, you see that government can do things perhaps in land acquisition or something like that the market can. Similarly, at the other end of extremes, market can do things that government can't. Maybe it has some proprietary knowledge around or systems it has. And what you have is a spectrum in terms of capabilities and competence. And we use economic theory in order to measure each of the activities. There's about 130 in that road, and we can identify where these activities sit in this spectrum. Now, we've heard today on many occasions this idea that we should allocate risk to the party best placed to manage it, right? So that maxim is essentially relates to 2, 3, and 5, and 2, 3, and 6 and 7. So what you see is that it's actually reflected. You've got a reflected spectrum around the middle point. As you get to the middle point, there's less difference in terms of capability and competence vis-a-vis the activity. Right, so what we've got in terms of 4 and 5 then is a situation where the activity is so specific to that piece of infrastructure that neither government or the market has actually done it before, and therefore you've got a level playing field in terms of competitive differences across the two. You've got sort of that neutrality situation. So we proceed to measure all the activities and we allocate them to one of these patterns. And what that tells us straight away is, if you think of a piece of cake, we've immediately sliced it down the middle. So activities 1 to 4 are delivered by government. They're internalised, they're insourced. All right? Whereas activities 5 to 8 are now the set of externalised outsourced activities that we consider in terms of the next step, which is bundling. Now, because we understand that 5 is a very specific activity, and also because 5 inherently may be uncertain, there is a high potential for hold-up. So in the example of the road that I talked about, the driven tunnel, the construction of the driven tunnel, because of the lack of geotechnics, was going to present a high level of uncertainty around the amount of engineering work and concrete and etc. that needed to go into it. And so that if that was on a fixed price, that would generate potential for significant hold-up. In that project I just mentioned again, the design of that driven tunnel, and I'm not sure why, but there was only one firm of engineers in Australia that could actually do that at the time. And what you'll see is you go out to that level 8, 7, 8, out to 8, you get this sort of monopoly supply, essentially, or the market around that. So what that means is that firm of engineers have got huge market power ex ante or before the contract is signed, because they're the only ones who can do it. And so what we try and do is avoid incorporating in a bundle the 5s and 8s because they're troublesome, because of the issue of hold-up. Whereas 6 and 7, we can actually transfer risk quite efficiently to the market, in contrast to 5 and 8. So what we did then is we looked at how we can actually, what that meant for this particular project. And we took out then, as I said, we took out the 5, which was the construction of the tunnel. And that, and my eyesight's going now, but the construction of the driven tunnel, where's that gone?
In the middle.
Yeah.
Contract number 3.
Construction, there you go, number 1, isn't it? Yeah, so that was the first construction package. And then the model was then telling us that we ought to also have a separate contract for the design of the, sorry. The construction of the driven tunnel and the cut and cover is contract 3. And that was a relational exchange, because that was our level 5 or a pattern 5. That's a relational exchange to embrace the fact that we're likely to see hold up. So there's a gain share, pain share regime here. Whereas we had a pattern 8, which was the contract 1, which was the design driven tunnel. This was the only engineer in Australia who could do it. And that was a bespoke contract with heaps of credible threats on performance. So it's extremely arm's length exchange. Dejan was alluding to that in one of his slides. In contrast, we have some efficient activities that make up the design, construction, the remainder of the contract. And the model came up with 2 design, a separate design and a separate construct only. But those 2 could have actually been put together. Oh, I got my yellow. That's okay. Right. So that was that, and this is the last slide. Okay, so we have now a situation where we have actually tested this model using expressions of interest. We found that the model was good in terms of where we had expressions of interest between 5 and 8. We found the model actually matched the actual approach, and outside of 5 to 8 the model mismatched, so it sort of supported the hypothesis we had. So that was great. So that's the first empirical test anywhere in the world of the goodness of a model using a proxy for value for money, which EOIs is. Okay, so just this final slide, moving forward from here, one of some of the limitations of the model. The first limitation is that there may be a lack of appetite amongst agencies for having multiple contracts. We suffer from a lack of competence. That's been mentioned today in terms of our agencies' competence in terms of procurement, and they might prefer to have a one-stop shop, not these multiple contracts. So what we want to do is we want to look to see how we can actually consolidate, because the model would create these multiple packages and multiple contracts. So what we can do is we can begin to understand, or we can begin to see how we can put that back together without losing the integrity of the model. And the simple way to do that, and in fact this is not new at all, any construction contract in the UK, any standard construction contract, or Australia for example, You take a standard construction contract, and the vast majority of it, 80% plus, might be a fixed price lump sum, and then you've got perhaps a small component which is provisional sums for works that can't be defined, and then you might have a small amount of money, small sum of money there for prime cost sums for nominated suppliers and subcontractors who are in a thin market. So essentially, you've got your 6 and 7s, which is the substantial fixed price component. You've got the 8, which is the the nominated supplier, and you take that out and you nominate those suppliers so that you maintain competitive tension in the rest of the package. And the provisional sums are pattern 5. So you can actually create a whole contract just by using multiple. I've got my red card. First one today. So does that mean I'm done? Except to say, thank you very much. I'll keep this as a souvenir. So the last couple of things are that the model really looks to grab, first of all, activities which are specific to a new piece of infrastructure. So like in schools, cleaning across schools is not specific to that school. The detergent, the bucket, and so on, we can use in multiple schools. So we can actually procure those as a network. So the model hasn't been applied to networks yet, which is something I'd like to do with Dejan. And we can build on the insights of the report that's been done. I can see now already, standing on the shoulders, what you guys have done. We can apply it. And the last thing, we are doing an analysis of schools in Australia, PPP, non-PPP schools, total costs, design, construction, operation, maintenance, finance costs across PPPs, non-PPPs, and the performance. And it would be fantastic if we can do that in roads as well. Thank you.